There is a particular kind of silence that lives inside a broke man's chest. Not the silence of peace, or prayer, or patience. The silence of a man who has stopped arguing with himself because he has run completely out of counter-arguments. I have sat beside that silence more times than I can count, in the back pews of churches with peeling paint and no congregation, in truck cabs where the heater quit 40 miles from town, in the small hours of a Tuesday when the world simply refuses to offer any next step. I know that silence because I carry a version of it in me too. But I had never seen it wear the face it wore on Reuel Canby the morning he stood on the steps of Cordell Prairie Baptist Church with $90 in his shirt pocket and stared at the locked front door like it owed him something he could never collect. He was a large man, not in the softened, polite way people sometimes mean when they say large. They mean wide and round and slow-looking, the kind of large that makes strangers on a street corner shift their eyes or make a half-joke the man is supposed to laugh at, which he does, because laughing is easier than explaining that he's been large his whole life, and that the body you live in is not a commentary on your character, however much the world would like it to be. Reuel was that kind of large. 6 feet and 2 inches of it, somewhere north of 270 in a pair of Wranglers that had seen 3 full years of daily use, a tucked-in Western shirt with a snap pocket, and a hat that had started life as a good resistal, but now looked like it had survived a flood and several difficult conversations. He was 46 years old. He had in the past 14 months lost his truck to a blown engine he couldn't afford to rebuild, his lease on 312 acres of grazing land to an oil company's mineral rights expansion, his cattle operation 42 head, which doesn't sound like much but was his entire livelihood, to a price collapse that took his margin to 0 and then kept going, and his dog, a red heeler named Corporal, to a snake bite in early November that still made Reuel's jaw tight when anything mentioned it. The $90 in his shirt pocket was the remainder of what he'd taken in selling his saddle, a Circle Y roping saddle he'd carried on his lap in the back of his neighbor's truck to a shop in Shamrock that gave him $120 for it and didn't haggle, minus $30 he'd spent on groceries and a fuel can to get his neighbor's truck back home. $90. In the spring of 1968 in the Texas Panhandle, that was enough to cover approximately 11 days of bare subsistence living, if a man was careful and didn't get sick. Reuel Canby was not careful. He was standing in front of this church because he had done what broke, desperate, end-of-rope men sometimes do when they have run out of rational choices. He had decided to give the last of it away. He didn't know I was watching him. I was sitting in my supply truck on the side street to the east, trying to find the church's deacon in my ledger. I was 3 stops behind schedule, and the altar wine for Cordell Prairie's monthly communion service was leaking slowly through a cracked case seal into my floor mat, and I was not in the best humor. I had counted 17 steps from my truck door to the church's side entrance when I parked. I count out of habit. Virgil Mack, deacon and courier, always counts the steps. It's a useless piece of information in almost every situation, but it gives my hands something to do besides shake. I watched Reuel Canby stand on those church steps for 4 minutes before he did anything. Then he pulled the money from his pocket, folded it once without looking at it, and knocked on the door. That was the morning the story started. It took 3 months to finish. What was behind that altar, I am still, all these decades later, uncertain how to explain it. Not because it defies explanation, but because some things resist the particular flattening that explanation requires. There are things a man discovers that change the shape of the room he's standing in, and once the shape changes, you cannot go back to remembering the room the way it was before. Reuel Canby discovered one of those things. I did not leave Cordell Prairie that day. That was not the plan. The plan, my plan, the one I had written in the margin of my route ledger in the careful, optimistic way I always write plans, with times and mileage estimates, and the names of the contact persons at each stop, had me leaving Cordell Prairie by 11:30, stopping in Wellington for a noon delivery, making Childress by 2, and reaching Lubbock by 6 in the evening with enough time to eat something that wasn't from a paper bag before the motel's office closed at 8. None of that happened. Instead, I sat in the vestry of Cordell Prairie Baptist Church until 12:45 in the afternoon, while Reuel Canby and Herb Cates went through the contents of the cedar box a second time, slowly, with Herb Cates providing what context he had from his predecessor's notes. And from his own 40 years of watching this county rearrange itself around the consequences of things it had done, and preferred not to discuss. I sat on a low wooden bench along the vestry wall and kept my ledger open in my lap and wrote nothing in it. My pen was in my hand. I kept not using it. There are moments when writing things down feels like the wrong response. I have kept records my entire adult career: delivery manifests, mileage logs, contact notes, the occasional personal observation in the back pages of a ledger that nobody will ever read but me. The record-keeping instinct is so deep in me by now that I sometimes find myself drafting the documentation of an experience before the experience has finished happening, which is not always a productive way to live. But that afternoon in the vestry, with the April light moving slowly across the plain board floor and Ruel's large hands turning the pages of a 32-year-old account of a family's dispossession, I kept the pen still. Some things want to be witnessed before they want to be recorded. Herb Cates made a phone call from the small office off the vestry. There was a rotary phone on the desk, black, with the kind of heavy receiver that felt like it had opinions, and spoke to someone at the county clerk's office in chill dress. The conversation was brief and somewhat oblique, as conversations with county offices tend to be when they concern matters that the county would prefer remained in the category of things that are technically true but not actively acknowledged. When he came back, he sat down heavily in the desk chair and folded his hands on the desk and looked at Ruel. "The parcel is still recorded in Sutton family ownership," he said. "Calvin Sutton died in 1957. His son, Gerald Sutton, inherited. Gerald Sutton died in 1965. The current owner of record is Gerald Sutton's widow, a Mrs. Pauline Sutton who lives in Amarillo." He paused. "The parcel is currently leased for grazing." Ruel was very still. 612 acres, Herb Cates said. "It's been in Sutton hands for 34 years. "What about the deed in the box?" I said, because someone needed to ask it. Herb Cates looked at me. "That's the question, isn't it?" He looked at the cedar box on the desk. "A deed that was never recorded because the family was prevented from recording it before the forced sale proceeding was initiated is a complicated legal instrument. Whether it has standing, whether it can be contested, whether the statute of limitations on fraud applies, whether the forced sale proceeding can be challenged after 34 years, those are questions I am not equipped to answer. They require a lawyer." "Does Ruel have a lawyer?" I asked. "No," said Ruel. At the same moment Herb Cates said, "No." And they looked at each other with the expression of two men who have both just said the same obvious thing. "Do you know any?" I said. Herb Cates tilted his head slightly. "There's a man named Delbert Oakes in Childress. He handles property matters. He's honest, which in a county attorney is worth specifying." He paused. "He's also 80% retired." "Would he talk to us?" Herb Cates looked at Ruel. Ruel looked at the cedar box. "I'll call him," Herb Cates said. While he was on the phone a second time, Ruel walked to the vestry window. It faced the side street, a narrow double-hung window with a cracked putty seal, the glass slightly wavy in the old way, and stood looking out at nothing particular. The line of his shoulders was different from what it had been in the sanctuary. Not relaxed, Ruel Canby was not, I would learn. A man who relaxed in any obvious way, but changed in some subtle structural way. The way a wall looks different when you learn its load-bearing. "You know this family?" I said. "The Tillmans, you said your grandfather mentioned them." He didn't turn from the window. He mentioned them the way he mentioned things he was angry about but wouldn't talk about directly. My grandfather was not a man who talked about injustice directly. He talked around it. He'd say something like there used to be a Tillman family out past the Cutter Draw, good people, gone now, and then he'd be quiet in a particular way that meant the subject was closed, but not because it was resolved. He paused. "I was 11 when he died. I didn't know enough to ask the right questions." "Do you know where they went, the family?" "Clara Tillman," he said. "That's the name on the letter. I don't know anything about her beyond that." He turned from the window. "But I'm going to find out." I believed him. That was the thing about Ruel Canby, and I was beginning to understand this in a way that felt important, that he was not a man who made declarations. He stated intentions the way he stated facts, in the same flat, even register without theater, which meant when he said "I'm going to find out," it carried the weight of something already decided, not something being decided. Herb Cates came back from the phone with the expression of a man who has gotten halfway. Yes when he needed a yes. Delbert Oaks will see you Friday, he said. 2 o'clock in chill dress. Reuel nodded. I'll be there. You said you had a job interview Friday, I said. I did, he said. 9 in the morning, I'll be done by noon. I looked at him. Do you have a way to get to chill dress? He was quiet for a moment. I'll borrow my uncle's truck. Your uncle's truck has a broken alternator, Herb Cates said. I heard that from Earl Pittman 2 weeks ago. Reuel's jaw tightened. I'll figure something out. I looked at my ledger. My route the day after tomorrow went through Childress. I would be there by 1:30 if I stayed on schedule, which I would not, but I would be there by 2 if I pushed the morning. I looked at my pen and then at Reuel's profile, the large, still face, the set jaw, the hands that had been carrying nothing for 14 months and were now holding the edge of something he didn't know the shape of yet. I'll drive you, I said. He looked at me. You don't have to do that. My route goes through Childress on Friday, I said. I'll pick you up at 1, you tell me where. He held my gaze for a moment in that assessing way of his, the check he always ran before accepting anything. Then he said, My uncle's place is out on County Road 31. You'll see a hand-painted gate, gray paint, says Canby on a board. I'll find it, I said. I left Cordell Prairie at 1:15. I was 2.5 hours behind schedule, which meant my Wellington stop would be short, my Childress stop would be rushed, and I would not reach Lubbock until after 8. The motel would be locked. I would be sleeping in my truck, which I have done enough times that I keep a folded blanket behind the seat for exactly this purpose, and try not to think of it as a failure of planning. I drove the first 20 miles on Route 83 with the windows down and the warm April air coming through flat and dry, and carrying the smell of plowed ground and the very beginning of spring grass in the low places. The panhandle in April is a particular thing. It has that quality that very large flat spaces sometimes have, of making a person feel simultaneously very small and very accountable. There is nowhere to hide from the scale of it, no feature to fix on that says this is where you are specifically and nowhere else. Just the enormous sky and the land going away in every direction, and the road cutting through the middle of it, which is either terrifying or clarifying depending on the day you're having. I had a clarifying kind of day. I thought about the cedar box. I thought about Clara Tillman writing that letter in the spring of 1936. She would have been, I estimated, probably in her 50s or 60s at the time. A woman who had watched her family's land taken through a process she knew was wrong, and had documented it carefully and given the documentation to a church, and trusted it to the keeping of a man she believed was good. Her trust in Ezekiel Canby was evident in every line of what Herb Cates had described to me. The trust was not naive. It was the trust of someone who had assessed the available options and selected the one that seemed most likely to hold. And then Ezekiel Canby had died in 1941, 5 years after the box went under the altar, and the holding had fallen to a man who held it without acting on it for 40 years. And now the box had been opened by a man who had come in with nothing and given what little he had and said you'll have to work with that. I thought about what Clara Tillman's letter had done to Reuel's face. I hadn't read it. I wouldn't read it. But the face was there in my memory, that slow settling of something, that quality of completion in the ripples. Whatever the letter said, it had not broken him. It had done something more complicated than that. It had given him a direction. A broke man with a direction is a different creature from a broke man without one. Friday came with low clouds and a west wind that had a last-of-winter quality to it, sharper than it should have been for late April. I drove County Road 31 at 12:50 and found the gray gate easily. It was the only painted gate on that stretch, and the board that said CANBY was weathered but legible, the letters done in a careful hand that spoke of someone who had once taken pride in the place. Reuel was waiting at the gate. He had on clean clothes, clean versions of the same kind of clothes, Wranglers and a western shirt. The shirt pressed in the way that a man presses a shirt when he's doing it himself without a real iron, using the weight of his hands on the cloth over a flat surface. His hat was the same battered resistal. He was holding a manila envelope that he'd clearly reinforced with a piece of cardboard inside to keep it flat. He climbed in and set the envelope on the seat between us and said, "Morning." "Afternoon," I said, barely. "Right." We drove without talking for a few minutes. He looked out at the road, and I drove, and the wind moved the roadside grass in long, slow rollers that looked almost like water. "How was the interview?" I said. "They offered me the job," he said. "That's good. It's 38 hours a week at $2.10 an hour," he said. "County road maintenance, culvert work, pothole filling, that kind of thing." He said it in that same flat, declarative way. I took it. "When do you start?" "Monday." "And Friday?" I said. "And Friday I'm going to see a lawyer in chill dress," he said. "Yes." I nodded. Outside, a hawk was working the wind over the road ditch, hovering without moving, one of the great optical illusions of the panhandle, a thing appearing perfectly still while actually working very hard. I watched it until the road curved and took it out of view. "Did you sleep?" I said. He looked at me. "What kind of question is that?" "The kind I ask people who I think didn't sleep." A pause. "Some. Did you read the letter again?" A longer pause. He looked out the window. "3 times," he said. "Stopped after 3 because I had it memorized and that felt like enough." I didn't ask what it said. He didn't offer. We drove in the quiet that had developed between us over the past 3 days into something that felt less like the silence of strangers and more like the silence of 2 people who have agreed, without discussing it, on what doesn't need to be said. Delbert Oaks occupied the upper floor of a 2-story building on Commerce Street in Childress that housed a title company on the ground floor and his law practice on the second. The stairs were narrow, and the railing was a different color than everything else, suggesting a recent repair, and the hallway at the top smelled of old paper and the particular brand of furniture polish that offices use when they want to give the impression of order without the effort of achieving it. Oaks himself was in his late 70s, not 80% retired. I revised upward to 90, with a fringe of white hair, the large-knuckled hands of a man who had done physical work before law, and the careful, slightly formal manner of a person who has spent decades learning exactly how much to say and exactly when to stop. He wore a blue seersucker jacket that had seen many better seasons, and a bolo tie with a turquoise stone that was either very good or very old or both. He shook Ruel's hand and looked at him for a moment in the way that older people sometimes look at younger people they're assessing, not unkindly, but seriously, as if taking the measure of the person before deciding how directly to speak. "Herb Cates tells me you found something significant," he said. His voice was dry and precise. "I'd like your opinion on what it is," Ruel said, and put the manila envelope on the desk. Oaks went through the documents slowly and thoroughly without speaking. He put on a pair of reading glasses, wire-framed, mended at the left hinge with a thin strip of white medical tape, and read the account in full. He held the deed up to the window light to examine the notary stamp. He read the survey document. He set them all down and took off his glasses and folded them and held them in one hand and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Where's the letter?" he said. "Not included," Ruel said. "That's personal." Oaks looked at him. "Does it contain anything legally relevant?" Ruel thought about this for a moment. "It might," he said. "I'll tell you if it does." Oaks accepted this. He picked up the deed and looked at it again. "The notarization is legitimate," he said. "I recognize the stamp. Harlan County had a notary named Prescott in those years, died around 1940. This is his mark." He set it down. "Which means this deed was properly executed. The Tillman family had a valid deed in 1933. "But they couldn't record it," I said. I was sitting in the chair along the wall, in what I had taken to be the client's seat, only to discover it was clearly the chair for whoever accompanied clients, slightly farther back, slightly lower. I had counted 6 steps from the door to my current position, because the forced sale proceeding was initiated before they could. Oaks looked at me with the mild, professional surprise that lawyers sometimes exhibit when someone in the background speaks accurately. "Essentially," he said, "a deed has no legal standing until it is recorded in the county's deed records. If a competing claim, even a fraudulent one, is recorded first, it takes precedence under most circumstances." He paused. "In 1933, the law has evolved somewhat since then." He looked at Ruel. "But I want to be precise with you about something." "Please," Ruel said. "I can read these documents and tell you they look compelling. I can read this account and tell you the procedural irregularities it describes, if accurate, would constitute fraud in any reasonable interpretation of the term. I can tell you that the deed appears valid on its face." He set his glasses on the desk. What I cannot tell you, honestly, is whether any of this rises to a level that a Texas court in 1968 would be willing to examine, given the age of the matter, and the fact that the Tillman family is no longer present to press the claim. He paused. The question of legal standing, of who has the right to press this claim, and whether any court would hear it, is where it gets complicated. The Tillman family might still have surviving members, Reuel said. If they do, and if those members can be identified and located, and if they are willing to pursue this, there may be a path, Oakes said. It would be long and uncertain and expensive. I know that, Reuel said. I want to make sure you know it clearly, Mr. Canby, because, forgive me, Herb Cates told me a little about your situation, and I don't want you to go down this road on the basis of. I started a county road job on Monday, Reuel said. $2.10 an hour, 38 hours a week. I know what I have and I know what I don't have. His voice was even and contained. I'm not asking you to tell me there's a guarantee. I'm asking you to tell me if there's a direction. Oakes looked at him for a long moment over the desk, and something in the old lawyer's expression shifted, not quite admiration, but its older cousin, the thing that looks like respect in the face of someone who has stopped being surprised by most things. There is a direction, Oakes said. Find the family. That was the assignment then. Find a family that had left Cordell Prairie, Texas in the spring of 1936, in the worst years of the Dust Bowl migration, moving away from land that had been taken from them, moving toward, the letter said, Reuel told me this much, California. A family with the name Tillman. A woman named Clara, who would now be in her 80s if she was living. I want to describe what that search looked like in practice, because I think people who have not done this kind of looking, for a person, a family, a thread of a life that has gone somewhere else and stopped leaving obvious marks, sometimes imagine it as a kind of inspired detective work, a series of clever deductions that lead in a clean line to an answer. It is not like that. It is like trying to find a specific rock in a creek bed by reaching into the water in slightly different places until your hands land on something. Reuel did not have a telephone at his uncle's place. The house did have a line, but his uncle, a man named Dix Canby who was in his mid-80s and strongly opinionated about telephone bills, had it disconnected in 1964. Reuel's access to a telephone was therefore limited to Me's Diner, which had a pay phone at the back near the men's room, and the post office on Elgin, which would let him use the office phone in emergencies and had a generous interpretation of what constituted an emergency. He wrote letters. I know this because over the following 6 weeks, I ran the same route every 3 weeks, and on 2 subsequent passes through Cordell Prairie, I stopped at Me's and found Reuel in the corner booth with a cup of coffee and his county road crew calluses getting deeper. He told me about the letters. He wrote to the county clerk's offices in the San Joaquin Valley counties that had received the largest influxes of Dust Bowl migrants. He wrote to churches, Baptist churches specifically, since the Tillmans had been members of Cordell Prairie Baptist, and people tend to find their denomination when they relocate even when they can't find much else. He wrote to the Oklahoma and Texas Migrant Worker Welfare Association, which had offices in Fresno and Bakersfield, and maintained, among other things, records of families who had registered for assistance during the migration years. He worked the road crew 5 days a week, 6 in the morning until 2:30, and came home to the room at his uncle's place, which he described as containing a bed, a window, a table, and a chair, and which he had furnished additionally with a stack of writing paper and a box of envelopes, and wrote letters in the evenings. He didn't complain about this. He reported it matter-of-factly as a set of activities. He told me about the responses he received, mostly negative, mostly variations on no record found or our records from that period are incomplete, with the same flat evenness he brought to everything, not pretending they didn't sting but not performing the sting either. He was looking, that was the whole of it. He had opened his hands, as his grandfather had said to do, and instead of finding nothing, he had found a 32-year-old cedar box and a direction. And now he was walking in that direction with the same procedural determination he brought to filling potholes and culverts, one step at a time, without expecting the road to be grateful. On my second return to Cordell Prairie, mid-May, a Thursday warmer now, the spring fully arrived, he had received one response that was not a no. A Baptist church in Tulare, California, the Calvary Road Baptist Church, had written back to say that they had no member by the name Tillman currently, but that their congregation had included, in the years 1940 through 1959, a family of that name. Their records showed a Mrs. Clara Tillman and her son, Robert Tillman, as members during that period. Mrs. Clara Tillman had died in 1961. Robert Tillman had been a deacon at the church from 1953 to 1959, when he had moved his family, a wife and 2 children, to Fresno. Robert Tillman, Clara's son, possibly in Fresno. Reuel set the letter on the table between us with both hands, flat, the way you set something down that you don't want to move by accident. His hands stayed on the table's edge after the letter was down, bracketing it. "That's real," I said. "It's something," he said. "Do you know anyone in Fresno?" "I don't know anyone in California," he said. I thought for a moment. "I can try some contacts through the diocesan office," I said. "Episcopal churches in Fresno, they'd know the Baptist community or could ask around." He looked at me. "You don't have to do that." "I know," I said. "I'm doing it anyway." He looked at the letter for a moment. Then he looked at me with an expression that was not quite gratitude. Reuel Canby was uncomfortable with gratitude in the way that self-sufficient people often are, not because they don't feel it, but because accepting it requires acknowledging need. And acknowledging need is a thing you practice rather than a thing that comes naturally. But with something adjacent to it, something that contained gratitude and also the recognition that he had been seen trying, and that being seen trying is its own kind of exposure. And that the exposure had not produced humiliation. "Your grandfather's name," I said. "Ezekiel." "Yes." Clara Tillman trusted him. She trusted this church with this box because of him specifically. "I know that," he said. "What do you make of that?" He was quiet for a while. Outside, Me's lunch trade had picked up. The counter stools were full, the other booths occupied, the sound of plates and conversation filling the room at the warm, overlapping frequency that a diner achieves when it's doing what a diner is for. Reuel sat in the corner of it like a man who has learned to be in the middle of things without requiring them to notice him. "I think he kept a promise he didn't know how to keep," Reuel said finally. "He tried the legal route and it went nowhere, and then he died before he could find another route, and the keeping fell to other people who weren't ready to do it." He paused. "And now it's fallen to me." He looked at the letter. "Which is maybe why it felt right to put the money in the plate. Not because I thought something magic was going to happen, but because my grandfather, every time he didn't know what to do, went and did something for that church. It was his version of keeping the hands open." He paused again. "I figured if I was going to be in his situation, I might as well try his method." "And it worked," I said. He looked at me steadily. "Did it?" "You have a letter from a church in Tulare," I said. "You have a name, Robert Tillman, Fresno, California." "I have a name," he said, "and I have no way to get there, no money to travel, no leave from my county road job, and no certainty that Robert Tillman would want anything to do with a man from Cordell Prairie showing up on his door." He paused. "So I have a name." "Yes. That's more than you had on a Tuesday in April," I said. He thought about that, then he picked up his coffee cup. "It is," he said. The contact through the diocesan office took 2 weeks and involved 3 forwarded letters and a phone call to a Father Marcus Webb at St. James Episcopal in Fresno, who knew the Calvary Road Baptist community and was willing to make an inquiry on my behalf. He called me at the diocesan office in Amarillo on a Wednesday morning in late May and told me that Robert Tillman was known to the Fresno Baptist community. He was 58 years old, a retired schoolteacher, and lived with his wife in a house in the Tower District neighborhood of Fresno. Father Webb had spoken to the minister of Robert's current church, who had spoken to Robert himself. Robert Tillman knew about the box. He had always known about the box. His mother, Clara, had told him about it before she died in 1961, had told him that she had left certain documents in the keeping of a church in Cordell Prairie, Texas, with a man named Ezekiel Canby, and that if the day ever came when those documents could be of use, they would be there. He had written twice to Cordell Prairie Baptist Church, once in 1963 and once in 1966. He had received no replies to either letter. When Father Webb explained what had happened, that the documents were still there, that a man named Reuel Canby had found them, that Reuel was trying to find him, Robert Tillman was quiet on the phone for what Father Webb described as a very long time. Then he said, "Is he Ezekiel's grandson?" "Yes," Father Webb told him. Another silence. Then Robert Tillman said, "Then he should come." I told Reuel this in Me's diner on a Thursday afternoon in early June, reading from a letter Father Webb had sent me. Reuel sat across from me and listened without interrupting. His face did that thing again, that slow, quiet movement through layers of something, but this time when it settled on something I had not seen there before. Not relief exactly, not even hope in any simple sense. Something more like the expression of a man who has been walking in a direction in the dark, and has just felt the ground under his feet change. Not into light, not into safety, but into something that confirms the direction was correct. "He knows about the box," Reuel said. "His mother told him. And he wrote twice to the church." "Herb Cates," I started. "Herb Cates didn't reply," Reuel said. "It was not an accusation. It was the flat declarative again, just the fact." "No," I said. He was quiet for a moment, then, "All right." "He wants you to come," I said. "I heard that part. Can you get to Fresno?" He looked at the table. I could see him running the calculation, the county road job, the time it would take, the money he didn't have. A one-way bus from Amarillo to Fresno in 1968 was somewhere around $18. A round trip was $35 if he went Greyhound and didn't eat. He had been making $2.10 an hour for 6 weeks. He had been sending $10 a month to a back tax bill he owed on the Canby family property, a different piece of land, the original home place, which he was quietly, steadily trying to recover from the county. He had, I estimated, in the range of $60 to $80 in a savings account he'd opened at the Cordell Prairie First State Bank, which was the first savings account he'd had since his truck's engine blew. "I can get there," he said. "Not until August. I'll need to put in for leave." He paused, "and I'll need to borrow bus fare." "I'll lend you bus fare," I said. He looked at me, the assessment, the check, the decision. $35, he said. "I know what the bus costs," I said. "I'll pay you back in 3 months." "You'll pay me back when you have it," I said. "Take the 35. He held my gaze for a moment, then he looked at the window. "You know," he said slowly, "when I put that money in the plate, I wasn't asking for anything specific. I wasn't even sure I believed anything was listening." He paused. "I just thought I've been holding on to the last of it so tight that my hands are cramped, and I didn't want my hands to be cramped anymore." "And now," I said. He was quiet for a long moment. The diner noise moved around us. Me was refilling the counter stools. A screen door somewhere opened and closed with the warm summer snap of a door that fits its frame. "My hands are still open," he said. "But there's something in them now." He didn't say what it was. He didn't need to. He went to Fresno in August. I know this not because I drove him to the bus station in Amarillo. I didn't. He arranged that with a man from the road crew who was going to Amarillo anyway on that Saturday. But because of the postcard I received at the diocesan office in the 3rd week of August. It was a standard California tourist postcard, the kind that shows an orange grove with perfect blue sky, sent from Fresno. On the back, in handwriting that was careful and slightly compressed, the handwriting of a man not accustomed to writing on a 4x6 surface. Virgil met Robert Tillman and his wife Lena on Tuesday. We sat in their kitchen for 4 hours. He has his mother's survey map, her own copy, with notes in her hand. He has been waiting to meet someone from Cordell Prairie his entire adult life. We're going back to see Delbert Oaks in September. R.C. I read it twice. Then I put it in my ledger, flat between the back pages, where I keep the occasional things that don't belong to a delivery record but want to be somewhere. A few days later, I found myself driving north of Cordell Prairie on a supply run, on a county road that ran out past a draw that might have been called Cutter's, and I pulled the truck over on the shoulder and got out and looked north across the flat, enormous land. Somewhere out there, past visible distance, was a parcel of 612 acres. Tillman's branch ran through it still, presumably. Creeks don't change their names when the people who gave them their names are gone. They just flow without the name attached, and anyone who looks at the water sees only water. I stood by the truck and counted the steps back to the door. 7, same as always from a truck parked on the shoulder, accounting for the running board. The number hadn't changed. But I had the strong and peculiar sensation that the ground between here and the horizon was not the same ground it had been on the Tuesday morning in April, when a large, broke, determined man had knocked on a church door and put everything he had in an offering plate and said, "You'll have to work with that." The wind was up, the grass moved. I got back in the truck and drove on. What happened in September, what Reuel and Robert Tillman and Delbert Oakes built from those documents, and what it cost, and what it became, that is part 3. September in the Texas Panhandle has a quality that April doesn't. April is tentative. It arrives with the smell of possibility, with that particular quality of air that has stopped being winter without fully committing to anything else. April is a month that keeps its options open. September is different. September has made its decisions. The summer has burned everything it was going to burn, and the land has come to terms with it. And the sky has shifted from the blinding, hard-edged blue of summer to something deeper and more complicated, a blue that is aware of what's coming. There is a quality of reckoning to September in flat country. The horizon looks closer. The light comes in at a lower angle, and shadows have length again, and you begin to feel, in the way that animals feel weather before it arrives, that the accounting is about to begin. I drove back through Cordell Prairie on a Tuesday in the second week of September on my regular route, and Reuel Canby was not at Me's. This was unusual. In the 4 months since April, every time I had come through Cordell Prairie on this circuit, Reuel had been at Me's at some point in the morning, either already there when I arrived or arriving shortly after, as if some internal scheduling system had aligned with mine. The corner booth had become, without any explicit agreement, a kind of meeting point. Me had begun setting 2 cups at the table without being asked, which in diner terms is the highest form of social recognition available. He wasn't there. I drank my coffee at the counter and asked me, in the casual way that I hoped masked the specific nature of my concern, whether she'd seen Reuel recently. "Yesterday," she said without turning from the griddle. "He was in here with a man I didn't recognize, black fella older than Reuel, well-dressed. They sat for about 2 hours. She paused, flipped something. Reuel looked like he hadn't slept in about a week. "Did they seem all right?" Me turned and looked at me with the precise expression of a woman who has been reading people across a counter for 40 years, and does not find the question subtle. "They seemed serious," she said. "Whatever they were talking about, they meant it." Robert Tillman, I thought. He'd come here to Cordell Prairie. I left Me's and drove to Herb Cates's house. He lived 3 blocks from the church in a small white house with a covered porch that held 2 rocking chairs and a very old dog who raised its head when I came up the walk and then lowered it again, having assessed me as insufficient grounds for action. Herb Cates answered the door in his shirt sleeves, which for him was the equivalent of formal disarray. "Virgil," he said. He stepped back to let me in. "I was going to call the diocesan office today." "Reuel's not at Me's," I said. "He's at the church," Herb Cates said. "He has been since 7 this morning. He and Robert Tillman and Delbert Oakes." He paused. "They've been there since yesterday afternoon, actually. They used my office. I let them be." He looked at me with those direct eyes of his, and in them was an expression I had not seen there before, not quite peace, not quite relief, but something that contained both and was perhaps closer to the word resolve, the resolve of a man who has decided to stop carrying something and is in the act of setting it down. "I think something is being decided," he said. "Do they need anything?" He was quiet for a moment. "I think you should go," he said. "They might need a witness." The church was unlocked. I went in the front, 11 steps from the walk, same as always, the number like a handshake, and stood for a moment in the back of the sanctuary, letting my eyes adjust from the September morning brightness outside to the cooler, dimmer interior. The smell was the same, wood and candle wax and decades of sincere effort. The light through the east windows had that lower September angle, the long rectangles on the floor stretching farther toward the center aisle than they had in April. Voices from the vestry, low and indistinct. I walked down the center aisle and stopped at the vestry door, which was open 4 inches, and knocked on the frame. The voices stopped. "Come in," Reuel said. There were 4 of them in the vestry, not 3. Reuel, sitting in the chair beside the window, hat on his knee the way he always wore it when he was inside. Delbert Oakes in the desk chair, his seersucker jacket over the back of it, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, papers spread across the desk in an arrangement that looked chaotic but was probably the lawyer's version of organized. And beside Oakes, in the second client chair, a man I had not met but recognized immediately from the combination of age and bearing, and something in the set of his face that I had seen in the photograph of Clara Tillman that Robert had brought from Fresno, and that Reuel had shown me once briefly in May. Robert Tillman was 58 years old, a retired schoolteacher who had spent 22 years in the Fresno public school system teaching mathematics. He was trim and upright in his chair, with close-cropped gray hair and the particular kind of stillness that people develop when they have spent a lifetime in rooms full of young people who needed them to be the steadiest thing present. He wore a dark green sport coat and a collared shirt without a tie. His hands were on the desk in front of him, flat, the way Reuel's hands had been on the cedar box documents in May. Still, but deliberate. And beside him, in a chair that had been brought in from somewhere and was slightly different from the vestry's own furniture, a folding chair with a padded seat, the kind of chair that suggests someone had thought ahead, was a woman in her early 50s, trim, with reading glasses pushed up on her head and a legal notepad on her knee and a pen in her hand. She had the focused, efficient quality of someone who had come here to work, and was in fact working, even in the moment of my entry, her pen moving slightly over something at the bottom of the pad. Robert Tillman stood when I came in, old-fashioned manners automatic. "Robert Tillman," he said, extending his hand. "Virgil Mack," I said. We shook. His grip was even like his mother's son's. "I'm sorry to interrupt." "You're not," Reuel said. "Herb said you'd be through today. I was going to find you after." "Me said you hadn't slept." "Me is observant," Reuel said without inflection. The woman with the notepad looked up. "Patricia Tillman," she said. "Robert's wife." She did not stand, which I respected. She was in the middle of something, and standing would have interrupted it. She had that quality of focused economy. "You're the one who drove him to Childress." "And lent him bus fare," Reuel said. "I came to pay you back," Robert Tillman said. He reached into his jacket and produced an envelope. $35, Reuel told me. "That's not necessary," I started. "I know it's not necessary," Robert said. He set the envelope on the desk beside Oak's papers. "Take it anyway." There was something in the way he said it, not the tone of a man asserting control or correcting an imbalance, but the tone of a man for whom this small repayment was part of something larger he needed to complete, a closing of a loop that had nothing to do with $35 specifically. I picked up the envelope and put it in my shirt pocket. "Sit down, Virgil," Delbert Oakes said from behind his papers. His tone was brisk but not unkind, the tone of a man who has been in the middle of something complex for a day and a half and has made peace with the pace of it but would prefer not to lose momentum. "This concerns you somewhat. You've been involved." I sat in the chair against the wall, 7 steps from the door, and counted them without thinking about it, and then thought. "All right, Virgil, pay attention." Oakes laid it out methodically. He had spent the 6 weeks since August preparing 2 things. The first was a legal analysis of the Tillman family situation, a genuine, researched analysis, not the preliminary assessment he'd given in April, but a document that examined the original forced sale proceeding of 1933, the applicable Texas property law of that period, the subsequent chain of title through the Sutton family, and the current legal landscape as it applied to potential fraud remedies in a case of this age. He had circulated this analysis informally to 2 colleagues in Amarillo and 1 in Austin. The conclusion was this: the case had genuine merit on its face. The procedural irregularities in the 1933 proceeding were substantial and documentable. The account in the cedar box, combined with the notarized deed and Robert Tillman's own testimony, and his mother's survey map, with her handwritten notations identifying the boundary markers, constituted a credible evidentiary foundation. The fact that the deed had never been recorded was a complication, not a fatal one. But the but was significant. A legal challenge of this kind, contesting a 35-year-old property transfer on fraud grounds in a Texas court, would require a sustained effort. It would require filing. It would require response. It would almost certainly require appeal. It would cost money that neither Reuel nor the Tillman family had. And it would require time that Robert Tillman, at 58, with a retired teacher's fixed income and a life built firmly in Fresno, was not certain he had or wanted to spend in a Texas courtroom. That was the legal analysis. The second thing Oakes had prepared was different. He had located the current owner of the parcel, Pauline Sutton, widow of Gerald Sutton, resident of Amarillo. He had obtained, through a title company contact, the current assessed value of the parcel. 612 acres of panhandle grazing land in 1968 was worth, at current rates, approximately $48,000. The parcel was currently leased for $1,200 per year to a ranching operation in the next county. Oakes had written to Pauline Sutton's attorney in Amarillo. Not a demand, nothing threatening or legally aggressive. A letter that described, carefully and precisely, the existence of certain historical documents relating to the parcel's original transfer and requested a meeting to discuss the history of the property. Pauline Sutton's attorney had called Oakes the previous week. Pauline Sutton was 73 years old. She had been aware, Oakes said, choosing his words with the precision of a man who had been a lawyer for 40 years, that her late father-in-law's acquisition of the parcel had involved, his word, her attorney's word, irregularities. She had been aware of this for most of her adult life. Her husband Gerald had been aware of it. Neither of them had done anything about it, in the way that people tend not to do anything about the uncomfortable origins of things they benefit from. When Oakes' letter arrived, Pauline Sutton had, according to her attorney, gone into her bedroom, closed the door, and not come out for 3 hours. Then she had come out and told her attorney to set up a meeting. The meeting had been 2 days ago, Monday, the day before Reuel and Robert and Patricia arrived in Cordell Prairie. Oakes had driven to Amarillo alone. Pauline Sutton was a small woman, he said, with white hair and the specific kind of frailty that is not weakness, but is instead the body's final accounting. A frailty that knows exactly what it is and is not pretending otherwise. She had sat across from Oakes in her attorney's conference room with her hands in her lap and looked at him directly when he spoke and not once looked away. She said, "I know what my father-in-law did. I know what my husband did not undo. I am an old woman, and I do not want to go to my death with this on my family." She had then made a proposal. The room was very quiet when Oakes finished laying this out. Patricia Tillman's pen had stopped moving. Robert Tillman's hands were still flat on the desk, but there was a tension in them now, a white-line quality at the knuckles. Reuel was looking at the floor. He had been looking at the floor for most of Oakes' summary, in the way he sometimes looked at things when he was processing rather than when he was absent. A deep, inward attention that wore the appearance of inattention. "Say it plainly," Robert Tillman said. His voice was even and controlled and careful. The voice of a man who has been very disciplined in this room for a long time. Oakes set his hands flat on his papers. "Pauline Sutton is prepared to deed the parcel back to the Tillman family," he said, "without litigation. Without compensation to herself beyond the existing lease payments through the end of the current lease year, which would bring her approximately $600. He paused. "She says she wants clear title returned to the rightful owners, and she wants a lawyer to confirm that she has done this properly, and she does not want any further discussion of her family's history in relation to the matter once it is done." The silence after this was different from the silences that had come before it. It had a different texture, the way a room's air changes when a window is opened, not louder, not busier, but different in quality. Fuller somehow. Patricia Tillman exhaled slowly. She looked at her husband. Robert Tillman looked at the desk. Then he looked at the cedar box, which was sitting on the corner of the desk where it had been sitting since yesterday. Closed now, the oilcloth rewrapped, sitting in the September morning light from the vestry window with the particular quality of old things that have been waiting a very long time in the dark and are now in the light and do not know yet what to do with it. "She wants to give it back," he said. Not a question. Just the fact said aloud in the same way that Reuel stated facts, as if saying it was the first step toward believing it. "Yes," Oakes said. "Without a fight. Without a fight." Robert Tillman was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, "What does Reuel get?" The question landed on the room like something set down carefully from a height. I looked at Reuel. Reuel looked up from the floor and looked at Robert with an expression that was startled in some way, not the startled of surprise, but the startled of a man who has been so focused on a direction that the question of what's at the end of it had not fully assembled itself in his mind. "Nothing," Reuel said. "This isn't." "I know what it isn't," Robert said. "I'm asking what he gets." Oakes said, legally, Reuel has no claim to the property. His role in this. I know his legal role, Robert said. He looked at Reuel. I'm asking what he gets. Reuel met his gaze. There was something between them in that moment, a conversation conducted in the gap between two men who have both lost things and found things in the same general territory of the heart, that I was witnessing without fully understanding, which is the appropriate relationship to have with moments like that. You are present for them. You do not own them. Nothing, Reuel said again. I found the box. I wanted to find you. That's all I wanted. That's all, Robert said. That's all. Robert looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the cedar box. My mother wrote that letter in March of 1936, he said. I was 26 years old. We were in California by then. We left in December of 35, which is a story I will tell you sometime if you want to hear it, and it is not a short story. He paused. She wrote to your grandfather before we left. I don't know what she said in that letter. She never told me exactly. But I know she trusted him. I know she believed that Ezekiel Canby was a man who kept his word, even when keeping it cost him. He looked at Reuel. You have his face, he said. Not exactly, but something in it. He looked down at the desk. My mother waited 25 years to die with this unresolved. She talked about that land not constantly, not in a way that consumed her, but it was there. It was always there. The way a missing thing is always there at the edge of things. She talked about Tillman's branch. He paused. There's a creek on that parcel. She used to bring me there when I was small. She said the water had a particular sound in the fall when the water was low, moving over the flat rocks at the bend. She could describe that sound exactly, 40 years after she'd last heard it. He paused. She never got back. Patricia Tillman's pen was very still. I'm a retired teacher, Robert said. I'm 58 years old and I live in Fresno and my children were born in California and I don't have any intention of moving to the Texas Panhandle. He said it without bitterness, with the clarity of a man who has been thinking about this for a long time and has arrived at precision. The land has 612 acres. I don't want to be a rancher. I don't know how to be a rancher. I would lease it. I would take the income from leasing it and I would do something with it that honors what my mother wanted for it, and that is a decision I would make over time with Patricia. He paused. That is what I want from this. He looked at Reuel again. And I want this man to have something, he said. For what he did, not legally, not formally, something. Reuel shook his head. Robert. Don't, Robert said. It was the same kind of gentle absolute that Herb Cates had used in April, the tone of a man who has decided something, and is communicating that the deciding is finished. You spent 4 months and $35 you didn't have and 6 weeks of county road crew pay writing letters to strangers because a box under an altar told you there was something unfinished in your family's history. You didn't do it for yourself. He paused. I know you didn't do it for yourself, which is exactly why I want to do something for you. Reuel was quiet. What do you need? Robert said. What Reuel needed, and this he said slowly, in the way that a man says something he has been thinking about but has not yet said out loud, so that the saying of it is also the first time he is fully hearing it, was the Canby home place. The original Canby family property, not the least grazing land, not the acreage his cattle operation had run on. The home place. 40 acres in the creek bottom north of Cordell Prairie, a different parcel from the Tillman land, the land his grandfather had built the original Canby house on in 1904. The house was still standing, barely. The land was encumbered by a back tax lien that Reuel had been quietly, inadequately paying down for 2 years, the same lien he'd been sending $10 a month toward, the one that had been growing faster than he was paying it. The total of the lien, as of September 1968, was $412. He said this quietly, with his hat on his knee, looking not at Robert, but at the cedar box on the corner of the desk, as if the box were the audience he was addressing, not the people in the room. He said it in the flat declarative, which with Reuel meant he had given up editing it and was simply stating the fact. 40 acres, he said. My grandfather's house, $412 of back taxes. He paused. That's what I need. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Robert Tillman looked at his wife. Patricia Tillman looked at her notepad. She wrote something on it, then she looked up. $412, she said, not a question. Yes, Reuel said. She wrote something else, then she looked at Oakes. If we pay the lien, does he have clear title? If the lien is cleared and no other encumbrances exist, Oakes said, yes. Patricia looked at Robert. Robert looked at Reuel. $412, he said. Against what your grandfather did for my mother. He was quiet for a moment. Against what you did. I didn't do it for payment, Reuel said. I know that, Robert said. That's why it's a gift, not a payment. He paused. Is there a difference? Reuel's jaw worked. His hands on his hat brim tightened and then released. He looked at the cedar box. He looked at the window. The September light was coming through at that low angle and hitting the opposite vestry wall in a way that made the old wood look warm and almost luminous, the grain of it visible, the age of it visible, the way wood looks when light treats it honestly. There's a difference, he said finally. Then take it as the first, Robert said. The paperwork took 6 weeks. Oakes handled both sides. Pauline Sutton's deed transfer to Robert Tillman on the Tillman parcel, and the lien clearance on the Canby home place, which required coordination with the county tax office and a title search, and the production of 2 documents that had been filed in the wrong folder in the Childress courthouse in 1961 and required a day and a half to locate. During this time, I continued my circuit through Cordell Prairie, and me continued setting 2 cups in the corner booth, and Reuel continued working the county road crew, a fact that did not change with the resolution of the lien, because 40 acres of creek bottom land with a barely standing house is not a livelihood. It was a place. A specific place in the geography of his family's history, and that was what it was worth, not in dollars. He moved back to the home place in early November, after the lien was cleared and the title was in his name, and he had spent 2 weekends patching the most critical failures in the roof with materials he'd scavenged from the road crew's salvage pile, and a sheet of corrugated tin. His Uncle Dick's contributed with the particular generosity of a man who claims he doesn't care about anything. The house was small, and the plumbing didn't work in the conventional sense, and there was no insulation worth mentioning, and the single gas heater in the main room was a thing that required negotiation rather than simply being lit. But it was where Ezekiel Canby had lived, and where Reuel's father had grown up, and where Reuel had spent the summers of his own boyhood, and it stood on 40 acres that now had, for the first time in 6 years, an owner who had both a legal claim to it and a reason to care what happened to it. I went out there once in early December, on a day when I had no reason to be in Cordell Prairie, except that I had finished my Wednesday route 2 hours early, and the thought of driving straight back to Amarillo felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. The house was set back from the county road by maybe 100 yards, at the end of a track that had once been graveled, but was now mostly dirt and intention. The afternoon was cold and clear, the sky that deep December blue that the Panhandle does better than anywhere I know. The cottonwoods along the creek bottom had gone gold, and then brown, and most of the leaves were down, lying in the low places in wet drifts. There was a line of smoke from the chimney. I parked and counted the steps to the front door. 22, longer track than I'd calculated. Reuel answered when I knocked. He had flour on his left forearm, which was unexpected and which I chose not to comment on. He looked different in this setting than he had in Me's or in the church or in the back of Oak's office. Not relaxed, still not relaxed, but located somehow. The way a person looks when they are in the right place for them, and the rightness of it is visible in how they stand. He let me in. The house smelled of wood smoke and the particular smell of a house that has been closed for years and is slowly becoming inhabited again. A smell of reawakening, of rooms remembering what they are for. There was a table in the main room with papers on it, and a stack of books and a coffee cup, and the clear evidence of a person in the process of establishing a life rather than merely surviving one. He made coffee on a gas ring, and we sat at the table, and I looked around at the house, and he looked at me looking and didn't comment on it. "How is it?" I said. "Cold in the mornings," he said. "The heater takes 20 minutes to get going, and I have to light it in a specific sequence, or it makes a sound that I don't like." He paused. "The creek is 50 yards from the back door. I can hear it at night." "Is that good?" He looked at his cup. "My grandfather used to talk about the sound of that creek," he said. "I hadn't heard it since I was about 12 years old." He paused. "It's good." I thought of Robert Tillman in his mother's description. She used to describe the sound of Tillman's branch in the fall, when the water was low, moving over the flat rocks at the bend. 2 families, 2 creeks, two sounds that had been carried in memory across the distance between here and wherever the wind took them. "Have you heard from Robert?" I said. "Last week," Reuel said. "He and Patricia are coming in the spring. He wants to see the land. The Tillman parcel. He wants to walk the boundary. He said he knows where every marker his grandfather put in is. His mother described them to him." He looked at the window at the cold December light. "He's going to lease it to a family in the next county. He said they'll call the creek by its right name in the lease agreement, Tillman's Branch." He was quiet for a moment. He said that mattered to his mother, that the creek keep its name. It had kept its name. The county map still showed it as Tillman's Branch. Creeks are stubborn about their names, as I had thought in May, and in this case the stubbornness had outlasted the attempt to erase the family it honored. We sat with our coffee for a while. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek and made a sound that was not quite a sound, more a pressure. The large, slow exhale of trees in winter, of a piece of land breathing in the particular way that land breathes when it is being paid attention to. "Virgil," Reuel said. "Yes." "You know what Herb Cates told me? After the papers were signed." He looked at the table. "He said he'd been wrong about one thing. He said he always thought the right person to open that box would be someone from the congregation. Someone who was owed something by the church, who had a legitimate claim on its resources." He paused. He said the reason he never acted was because the right person never came from inside the congregation, and he could never figure out how to explain to someone from outside why they should care about something this old and this difficult. He looked at his cup. He said what he didn't understand was that the right person wouldn't be coming because of what the church could give them. They'd be coming because of what they were already in the process of giving away. He said it without emphasis, just the statement. I sat with it for a moment. "He's not wrong," I said. "No," Reuel said, "he's not." The fire in the heater made it sound and then settled back. The cottonwoods moved. Somewhere along the creek, the water was going over the flat rocks at the bend, doing what it had done for decades before the Canby family arrived and would do for decades after, maintaining its particular sound in the way that water maintains its particular sound, which is to say completely and without memory and without intention and without any awareness that anyone has ever sat in a cold house in December and found it meaningful. I finished my coffee and stood up. "I'll be through again in 3 weeks," I said. "Mees," he said. "Mees," I agreed. I put on my coat and walked to the door. 22 steps back to the truck I counted without thinking. Same both ways. I put my hand on the door. "Reuel," I said. He looked up from the table. "The $90, I said. "What do you think it bought?" He looked at me for a moment. Then he looked at the table, at the papers and the books and the coffee cup, at the room that was slowly becoming a home again. He looked at the window and the cold December light and the bare cottonwoods and the line of the creek in the distance. Then he looked back at me. "Not what I thought," he said. He said it simply, not like a man who has found an answer, like a man who has found the right question finally after a very long time of asking the wrong ones. I nodded and went out. I drove the county road back toward Cordell Prairie in the late afternoon light, the sun going down behind me, the shadow of the truck stretching out long and thin on the road ahead, and I thought about what a man buys when he gives away the last of what he has. He doesn't buy a guarantee. He doesn't buy rescue or redemption or the resolution of anything specific. He doesn't purchase certainty or a future or a clear road forward, because those things are not for sale in the market he's shopping in. What he buys, what Reuel Canby bought with $90 in an offering plate on a Tuesday morning in April, was the specific act of opening his hands. And opening his hands put him in the room where the box was, and being in the room where the box was put him on the road to Childress. And the road to Childress led him to Robert Tillman's kitchen table in Fresno, California, where a retired schoolteacher and his wife sat across from a large, broke, determined cowboy from the Texas Panhandle, and the four of them spent 4 hours being honest with each other about things that had been unfinished for 32 years. And out of that honesty came a lien clearance of $412, and a deed transfer of 612 acres, and 2 families put back in right relationship with their own histories. Imperfectly, incompletely, in the way that such reckonings are always imperfect and incomplete, but genuinely. And out of that came Reuel Canby in a house along a creek in December with flour on his arm, and smoke from the chimney and the sound of water over flat rocks at night. That is what the $90 bought. The irony, and it is an irony, the particular kind that is not funny exactly, but that has the structure of a joke told by the universe at the expense of all our careful accounting, is this. When Reuel Canby walked into that church on a Tuesday morning in April 1968 and put his last $90 in the offering plate, he did it because he had nothing left to hold onto and wanted to stop holding. He didn't want the money back. He wanted to be done with it. He wanted to open his hands and find them empty. He got 40 acres, a home, a creek, a restored name, a family he didn't know he was connected to, and a story he will be telling for the rest of his life.